Today's true crime case involves 6 individuals, a case of troubled childhoods leading to troubled adulthoods. There are 3 victims in this case. This crime took place on April the 6th, 1997 in the state of Tennessee. But let me start with the background of the victims. Vidar Lillelid grew up in Norway and he moved to America in 1985. In 1989, he married Delphina. She was an American from New York. He met her through their involvement in the Jehovah's Witnesses. They had 2 children, Tabitha, born in 1990, and Peter, born in 1995. They were quite the religious family. Now I'm going to give you the background on all 6 suspects. Karen Howell was born on September 25th, 1979. She dropped out of school at the age of 16 after starting as a freshman at 3 different high schools. Karen claimed that she had been SA'd between the ages of 5 and 10 by her uncle and a cousin. She described herself as fearful of relationships. Until the age of 14, Karen lived with her mother, but they did not get on. They would always be fighting. Karen had a history of resistance to rules and regulations and inability to function in school. She engaged in illegal drug usage, runaway behavior, and an interest in witchcraft. This began by her use of a Ouija board and automatic writing. Her mother found some of the automatic writings and provided them to ministers who attempted to cast out demons. Karen claimed that she had created love spells to get 2 boys to date her. Wowzers. She believed that she was hearing voices. And for those that don't know, automatic writing is a claimed psychic ability allowing a person to produce written words without consciously writing, whatever that means. Now, by the age of 15, Karen was physically active. She started experimenting with illegal drugs using alcohol, marijuana, hashish, LSD, PCP, and cocaine. That's some smoothie. Wow. She had used LSD on 14 occasions, causing her to hallucinate. She spoke of 2 bad trips. Once she tried to chew her friend's arm, because that's what you do every day, and the second time she sat alone on the floor on the bathroom for hours. Karen then became involved with Natasha Cornett and Joseph Risner in school. She and Natasha shared an interest in witchcraft and they both claimed to hear voices. Karen said that she started hearing voices at the age of 13. You'll notice a theme in Karen's life where there's drugs, some form of occultism, and not the best relationship at home. This is a theme that's going to run through all our suspects, as now I'm going to talk about Natasha Cornett. She was born on January 26, 1979 in Kentucky. Natasha was born as a consequence of an extramarital affair by her mother. By the time she was 5, she learned that Roger Burgess, a police officer, was her natural father. Her mother, Madonna, did not remarry during Natasha's childhood. She had a number of relationships with other men. One of her boyfriends, Norman Bryant, made an attempt to be a father figure to Natasha. When Natasha was 7, however, Brian left the relationship because he grew weary of Madonna's persistent infidelities and her violent outbursts. Mom of the Year goes to Natasha. Grew close to her grandmother and was fascinated with her grandmother's discussions of the paranormal, an experience which contributed to Natasha's interest in the occult. Natasha herself, while in middle school, she started to dress in dark clothing. She painted her fingernails black and wore dark eye and lip makeup. Her grades began to fall, and at the age of 13, Natasha began to engage in physical relationships. Natasha and her mother would frequently fight. At the age of 14, Natasha was hospitalized for 11 days for psychiatric care. She continued weekly outpatient therapy thereafter. She was diagnosed with severe depression and was prescribed Prozac and lithium. She continued outpatient treatment for 4 months. You see, Natasha had started to use alcohol and illegal drugs, more specifically heroin, ecstasy, cocaine, and acid. Eventually, she dropped out of school at the age of 16. All them drugs by the time she's 16. When I was 16, I was watching Brazil win the World Cup. I worked at Pizza Hut. Yes, this is the very Pizza Hut I worked at. What a contrast. Natasha eventually married Steve Cornett on her 17th birthday. While she denied that her wedding was satanic, the couples dressed in gothic clothing and the maids of honor were chained together. The marriage lasted 10 months. Natasha suffered from depression as a consequence of the divorce and afterward moved to New Orleans, where she panhandled with a girlfriend and lived on the streets. Let's look at the background of Edward Dean Mullins. At the time, he was 19. He was born in Kentucky in 1978. You see, he left school in 1996 during his 12th grade, but he was working on his GED, had no criminal record, and had been employed at a grocery store in Kentucky during the 90s. His family and friends stated that his behavior worsened after becoming involved with Natasha, whom he had planned to marry. The fourth suspect is Joseph Ristner. He was born in 1976 in Kentucky. At the time, he was 20. He never met his biological father and adopted his stepfather's last name. His family lived in Columbia, Kentucky, but moved to Georgia when he started 4th grade. Joseph was described as a satisfactory student with a good work ethic until the separation of his mother and stepfather, which affected him emotionally. He and his mother moved back to Kentucky, where he had history of marijuana, alcohol, and LSD usage. He claimed that he had physical relationships with 2 of his babysitters when he was 12 years old. Cheeky bastard. Joseph declined academically, failing 7th and 8th grade before his marks improved in the 10th grade. And it was here where he met the other perpetrators, including his girlfriend, Karen Howell. Joseph joined the army in 1995, but received an administrative discharge after testing positive for marijuana. He earned a GED in 1996 and was accepted at Mayo Regional Technology Center in September 96. Joseph was the eldest of the group. The fifth suspect is Crystal Sturgill, who was 18 at the time. She was born in 1979 in Kentucky. Her mother, Teen Blackburn, refused to divulge the name of her father, and his name does not appear on her birth certificate. She was in senior year at high school, and she also attended Floyd County Technical School in Kentucky, where records indicate she had been a slightly above average student. Crystal's academic performance declined in high school. She blamed drugs and alcohol. However, she performed well on standardized tests, including a total score of 28 on her ACT. She had applied for admission to several colleges. She worked in the Betsy Lane Elementary School daycare as part of a co-op program. Her supervisors described Crystal as a capable child caregiver, and she received very high marks. Crystal herself had no prior criminal history as either a juvenile or an adult, but had been suspended from school several times. Observers commented on the amount of emotional neglect Crystal suffered in her home. In December of 96, she accused her stepfather of repeated SA. After the accusations, Crystal moved in with her aunt in Prestonburg, Kentucky. She began attending high school, but soon had to move out of her aunt's home. She lived in approximately 13 different places. Crystal was good friends with Dean Mullins, and she was critical of his relationship with Natasha. She had no history of violence nor criminal record before April 97. Finally, you had Jason Blake Bryant. At the time, he was 14. He was born in 1982 in Kentucky. He had an IQ of 85 and the emotional and social skills of an 11-year-old. He had a history of alcohol and drug abuse beginning as early as 3 and was in the 8th grade at Millard High School in Kentucky. He had met Natasha in Pikeville a month before the murders. Jason was the youngest of the group and was a legal minor at the time. So now let me tell you about the murders. The gang were en route from their homes in Kentucky to New Orleans, Louisiana. Now before leaving Kentucky, they had acquired two guns, a 9mm and a .25 caliber pistol. Shortly after their departure, they realized that their car, which belonged to Joseph, would not likely sustain the length of the trip. They discussed the possibility of stealing a car from a parking lot or a dealership, so they ended up at a rest stop. At this rest stop was the Lillelid family, and they were returning from a religious convention. Vidar, who I mentioned was an active Jehovah's Witness, approached Natasha and Karen at the rest shop in order to discuss his religious views. He was accompanied by his son, Peter. Eventually, Joseph and Jason joined the conversation. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lillelid and her daughter Tabitha were seated at a nearby picnic table. After a time, Joseph, Jason, Karen, and Natasha joined the entire family and continued their conversation, which would have been interesting. A lot of these kids were into the occult, Satan, etc., discussing religion with Jehovah's Witnesses. Certainly a lot to discuss. At some point, Joseph displayed one of the guns and he said, "I hate to do this to you, but we are going to have to take you with us for your van." He then directed the family into the van. Vidar pleaded with the group, offering his keys and wallet in exchange for permission to remain at the rest stop, but Joseph refused. Vidar drove the van while Joseph, still armed, sat in the passenger seat. He, Jason, Karen, and Natasha were in the van with the family. Dean and Crystal followed in Joseph's car. Now, in an attempt to calm the children, Delphina began to sing. Jason, however, told her to stop. Joseph directed Vidar first to the interstate and then to a secluded road at the next exit. But what happened after this is in dispute. 5 of them did give a consistent account. They claimed that Jason began to take charge of the situation once Joseph ordered the van to stop. Joseph, who was in possession of the 9mm weapon, contended that he gave the weapon to Natasha at that point, explaining that he could not continue. Natasha maintained that she placed the weapon on the floor of the van, while Jason, who had the .25 caliber gun, ordered the family to stand in front of a ditch. According to all but Jason, the family pleaded for their lives and especially for the lives of their children, promising that they would not call the authorities. Jason refused, and Natasha and Karen then pleaded with him to let the family go. According to the others, Jason again refused, explaining that the family would likely call the police. When he promised that he would not hurt the children, Karen and Natasha testified that they returned to the van where Joseph had remained. They had heard a rapid succession of gunshots. Some claim that Vidar was the first to be shot, while others say that it was Delphina. All contend that when the shooting stopped, Jason returned to the van and said, "They're still alive." He then grabbed the other gun and fired another round of shots. Jason then laughed and bragged about the shootings. After the shootings, Joseph went to his car and removed the license plate and registration from his vehicle. He claimed he accidentally struck one or more of the bodies when, in response to an order from Jason, he turned the van around. They each claim that Crystal and Dean remained in Joseph's car throughout. Jason testified that it was Joseph who ordered the family out of the van and directed them to stand by a ditch. He contended that Joseph first shot Vidar with a .25 caliber weapon and then tapped Dean on the shoulder, and that Dean also shot at the victims. Jason claimed that he kept his eyes closed during the shootings and that he never fired either weapon. He contended that Dean and Joseph ordered the others into the van after the shootings. They all then drove the van to a gas station where they purchased a road map. They stopped at a Waffle House while traveling through Georgia, but left the restaurant when a group of police officers arrived. They decided to abandon their plans to travel to New Orleans and instead drove to Mexico. When they reached the border, they were denied admittance because they did not have the proper forms, but eventually they found a way into the country. Now, while in Mexico, Jason was shot in the hand and leg. Jason testified that Joseph asked him to take the blame for the shootings because Jason was a juvenile. He claimed that when he hesitated, Joseph shot him in the hand and in the leg. Later, they were all stopped by the Mexican authorities. When they claimed they were lost, the officers ordered them out of the van and conducted a search. When they found a knife and a photo album belonging to the family, they ordered them to the border to re-enter the United States. At this point, American officers searched them at the Border Patrol and took them to an Arizona jail. At the time of their arrest, several of them had in their possession personal items that belonged to the Lillelid family. Upon their return to Tennessee, the state filed formal charges and provided notice seeking the death penalty for each individual. The first physical descriptions of the suspects was their wild haircuts and face piercings. They were quickly joined by tales of occultism, witchcraft, and satanic rites. Most of the stories revolved around Natasha, how she was married wearing a black dress and red cape, how she drank blood, how she signed her name backwards. She even gave interviews claiming she was Satan's daughter. If you read Natasha backwards, it's not quite Satan, but it almost is. During the trial in January of 1998, Leonard Martin Miller, a clinical psychologist, conducted 3 interviews with Karen. Karen explained to Dr. Miller that she had severe mood swings, which included episodes of extreme depression and uncontrollable crying. She stated that she also experienced manic phases when she laughed uncontrollably. According to Karen, her mother had been diagnosed with a bipolar disorder, and her behavior followed a similar pattern of depression and hyperactivity and rage. Psychological testing indicated Karen had an IQ of 78. Karen had the potential to function within the average range of intelligence and had an ability to speak effectively. Dr. Miller's conclusions were that Karen suffers from bipolar disorder, depression with psychotic features, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Karen did deny that she worshipped Satan, but confessed the belief that he did exist. She acknowledged that she attempted to contact spirits and demons through various rituals. She professed a belief in God and rejected the notion of animal and human sacrifices. Psychiatrist Robert Sadoff, who interviewed Natasha on 3 occasions for a total of 8 hours, reported that she had been hearing voices since the age of 2. She claimed that antipsychotic medications didn't help. He stated that she claimed to see some of the spirits or demons speak to her. She told Dr. Sadoff that the spirits sometimes predicted her future. He reported that Natasha believed she was hassled in school for being a freak. She was also smoking cigarettes by the age of 5. Wait, what? And that she was regularly high on marijuana after she quit school. She also acknowledged prior use of crystal meth, PCP, and other illegal drugs. She remarked that she had used LSD well over 100 times. The doctor reported that Natasha cried when discussing the murders. She claimed to be especially upset because she was unable to save the children. She said she would have left the group after the incident if she had known that her other friends would not have been hurt. The doctor concluded that Natasha was not psychotic nor out of touch with reality, but that she is clearly mentally and emotionally disturbed and has been for a number of years. He stated that she has symptoms of bipolar disorder and mixed personality disorder, and also has symptoms of dissociative disorder and antisocial traits. But in his view, she was not legally insane during the commission of these crimes. Now, each of the 6 defendants were indicted for 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, 2 counts of especially aggravated kidnapping, 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping, and 1 count of theft. And at this point, I've lost count. The sentencing hearing, conducted in February of '98 and it lasted 1 week. All of the defendants testified at the hearing, with the exception of Dean and Crystal. Dr. Cleland Blake, a pathologist, testified to the extent of the victim's injuries. He said Vidar, who at the time was 34, received a total of 6 gunshot wounds, 1 to the right side of his head and 5 to his chest. In the doctor's opinion, the first shot entered the victim's right eye, traveled through his temple, and exited in front of his right ear. While he could not be certain, it was the doctor's opinion that this shot was fired by a 9mm handgun and would have caused a loss of consciousness. Dr. Blake believed that the victim fell to the ground and was shot 3 times in the upper right side of the chest. He described the shots as consistent with a 9mm. He suggested that the 3 gunshot wounds to the chest were deliberately fired in order to form the shape of an equilateral triangle, and that the victim was lying on his back at the time. There was also a gunshot wound just below Vidar's nipple, and this was consistent with a .25 caliber weapon. There was also a grazed laceration on the victim's right forearm where a bullet skimmed across the surface of his arm. Dr. Blake believed that the victim most likely died within a few minutes of the initial gunshot to his right eye. As for Delphina, who was 28 at the time, she was shot 8 times. All 8 bullets were recovered. 6 were from a 9mm and 2 were from a .25 caliber. The first of these shots, fired by a 9mm, shattered the bone in her left arm. The second shot, also from a 9mm, shattered the thigh of her left leg. Dr. Blake testified that these shots would have caused severe pain but would not have produced her death. He believed that the victim would not have been able to stand after these wounds were inflicted, and Delphina was shot 6 times additionally when she lay on her back. The first 3 shots struck the left side of her abdomen. These shots were fired from a triangular pattern, similar to the injuries on Vidar. The 3 shots pierced her stomach, leaving a 4 to 5 inch mark, and traveled through her pancreas, spleen, left kidney, and left adrenal gland. A final 9mm entry wound was located at the midsection of Delphina's abdomen. Dr. Blake testified that her wounds were not immediately fatal and that she could have been conscious for as long as 25 minutes, including when her body was driven over by the van. As for 6-year-old Tabitha, she was shot once in the head by a small caliber weapon. The bullet entered her head on the left side, traveled downward, and exited behind her right ear, causing immediate brain death. Her organs continued to function through the use of life support until her uncle, who had been named her custodian, gave permission for the donation of several of her internal organs. She was pronounced dead 1 day after the shootings. 2-year-old Peter was shot twice with a small caliber weapon. 1 shot entered behind his right ear and exited near his right eye. A second gunshot penetrated his body from the back and exited through his chest. He was transported to the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at the University of Tennessee Hospital. He was listed in critical condition. He required vigorous resuscitation. There was a contusion to his right lung and some residual bleeding in his right chest cavity. 11 days after the shootings, doctors removed the damaged eye. He remained in the hospital for 17 days before being transferred to a rehab center. Peter survived. Now, as for sentencing for the suspects, a plea bargain was drawn up, in which the death penalty was taken off the table if all 6 pled guilty to first-degree murder. The DA stipulated that all 6 defendants had to accept the deal and do so within a very short period, or the death penalty would be pursued. All 6 defendants signed, and in March 1998 they were convicted of felony murder. As participants in a felony kidnapping and carjacking that resulted in 3 murders and 1 attempted murder, each received 3 life sentences, 1 for each murder, and an additional 25 years for the attempted murder of Peter. The 6 youths were sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The judge applied the same aggravated circumstances for all, but it was not determined which of them had the main blame for the killings. Court testimony by other people was that the youngest, Jason, had fired the shots, but the judge suggested that another undetermined member of the group might have also done so. Jason admitted to police in Arizona he did shoot Vidar, but this police testimony was not allowed as he had not been read his rights before he made this admission. But he did later change his story, saying Dean and Joseph, they did it. So to conclude, what can you make of it? In many ways, as sad as this sound, how else were their lives going to end up? Drug use, parents who weren't really there, depression, bipolar, mental illness, right? Their life was only going to end in one way, either an early death or this. But why go after those children? Why go after this family? Also, they could steal a car? What? Just a sad story all around. Comment, tell me what you think.